The Trinka Podcast, academic writing done right. My name is Dr. KK, your host. In this episode of the podcast, you will listen to me speak with Gayatri Phadke from Enago Academy team about inclusivity in academia, the LGBTQIA plus perspective. This is the third part of our conversation.
So I think I'll speak a little more about the US because I think I was there at a very interesting time within the US academia itself.
Could you
UK
date
was a
yourself? Could you?
sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was just about to get to that.
Yeah.
I was in the UK only for a year, and I was in London, right, from 2009 to 2010. Just by the fact that I was in London, it removes a lot of conversations or pain points from this entire conversation.
Right.
It's a very inclusive
Privilege.
place,
Yes.
privileged place.
Yeah.
You are, and living as a student in London is also very different from living as a student elsewhere because London doesn't really have campuses. You
Right.
have buildings that are spread out across, and you're part of the bigger city, really.
Yeah.
So there is a certain anonymity it brings to you, and it allows you to be a little more free about who you are, how you want to express yourself, all of that, right? But I think if we shift focus to the US a little bit more, US campuses are essentially the very definition of academic bubble, right?
Right.
They are very often isolated. There are very few campuses that are right in the middle of the city and very well integrated into the city without being,
Hmm.
little bubble within
Right.
the city. And then there are several campuses that are basically in the middle of nowhere, small town, that is essentially a university town, right?
Right.
Very often I felt, and I was teaching undergrads, so
Hmm.
I'll speak from a little bit of both the graduate community and the undergrad community. Um, Very often it's the first time people get to express themselves, right? And
Right.
that's why US is a weird place to live in. I mean, it's considered one of the most progressive countries in the world, but it's not a homogeneous country. There are certain parts of the US that are very
Yeah.
red, in the red, let's say,
Yeah.
all very much not progressive
Right.
on when it comes to LGBTQIA plus women's health rights, whatever
Right.
it is. And then there are extremely progressive parts who are perhaps ahead of the entire world in terms of certain conversations. And then you have academic communities that are essentially pockets of progressiveness, even within the most religious communities that might be present in those states.
Right.
So, very often it's the first time individuals get to express themselves, explore their sexuality, really try and understand who they are, and perhaps even be open about it,
Mm.
right? Um, as so, I was in the US from 2012 to 2018,
Mm.
and it was a very distinct time of the academic journey.
Right.
This is when there were a lot of conversations about DEIA.
Hmm.
The entire Office of Diversity and Inclusion was going through a sea change in terms of having a chief diversity officer. There were a lot of conversations around Obama presidency and then subsequently the Trump presidency
Right.
and the stark differences between the two.
Yeah.
So I would say that it was a time where there was a lot of conversation and a lot of different levels. I was also part of the labor movement. We actually formed a union of graduate student researchers, assistants, and that is a separate conversation. But it also gave me a platform to be an ally to advocate for policies that made academia, particularly the graduate school part of it, more inclusive for LGBTQI plus
Hmm.
community. But at the same time, like we have to keep this in mind that universities are places where people essentially explore themselves. They
Hmm.
find their voice. And it is very important for universities to create a space where people feel comfortable doing so.
Right.
At the same time, what we talked about when it comes to corporate culture and commoditization, I hope I'm spelling that right. But essentially, this dichotomy between how much to say and how to say it
Mm-hmm.
is so important. And I felt like there were definitely people who
Mm-hmm.
felt that this entire movement of creating diversity office or chief diversity officer, people definitely felt that it was a ploy for
Mm-hmm.
universities to make themselves stand out from the
Mm-hmm.
crowd rather than a genuine effort to create inclusive spaces, right? So
Right.
I don't think that academia necessarily is extremely different from corporate culture. Definitely, it's more likely that you find your group of friends, you find your community, you find those inclusive pockets
Mm-hmm.
within academia as well. But at the broader level, at the leadership level, there is still a very definitive move towards corporatization of universities. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why, that's what concerns me about this entire around diversity, that
Right.
is it being exploited for branding purpose, or are you actually
Mm-hmm.
being more vocal of your support for different communities within the academy?
Right. Right. So let me
And
ask
then,
you. Oh, sorry,
yeah,
sorry. Oh, you continue. I thought you had finished. Continue.
yeah, and then the other part of it is, you of course have rainbow centers or LGBTQIA plus centers for um, people of the community within those universities. They provide support in terms of you just want a quiet place to go and hang out, recharge,
Right.
just be away from people who might be harmful to your mental health.
Right.
They provide resources and so on. But there was also unequal access issue, I think, because of the different intersectionalities within the community, right?
Right.
And you briefly mentioned this, that not everybody can be experiencing their journey the same way,
Yeah.
right? So I very often felt that as an international student, there was unequal access to support, right?
Definitely. Yeah. I can
At
imagine. Yeah.
a broader level, graduate students felt that there was an unequal access to support compared to undergraduate students.
I see.
And the type of support that is required also changes. So then that could be, one of the reasons. So there's so many conversations within this broader umbrella of inclusivity and
Mm.
how you create those spaces that are actually equitable
Right.
rather than
Yeah.
equal,
Yeah. Right. Right.
right? And that was again a big conversation at that point of time through my involvement with the labor movement in our university. That are we aiming for equality or are we aiming for equitable
Mm.
environment?
Right. Right. Makes a lot of sense. I have some points. So as follow up, so one point I
Sure.
think I just it's more like a thing that I want to say, and maybe you can add your thoughts after that. So you mentioned that the chief diversity officer. We talked about
Mhm.
the corporate, the culture, the commodification of, let's say, things like such social causes. And one thing that I can think of in terms of generally understanding how society works or how change happens within society, uh, things happen initially, and they stick out, and that's what I'm trying to say. I don't have a better phrase to say it. So when things change, the initial bit of change appears made up and artificial,
Yes.
and eventually it becomes accepted as a thing. And so I noted down the chief diversity officer. Now I do not have too much of, I haven't read up about it, and in fact I would like to research further on whether diversity is such a like a prominent part of, let's say, Indian institutions. And the reason why
Mhm.
I'm talking Indian, because we live in India. And
Yeah.
one other thing for our audience is that we are trying to talk about our own experiences in the context of academia and LGBTQ. That does not mean that people from, let's say, Africa, or let's say of the Oceania, they also need such conversations to happen. And
Yeah.
if we don't have the experience to talk about it, that's the reason why we are sort of limiting ourselves to, say, currently US, UK, and India right now. But in the
Yeah.
future we hope to have
More
I'm yeah,
conversations
more conversation.
and a
And
broader range of voices.
yes, I mean, I'm hoping that, as part of Enago Academy podcast, as well as, I have another podcast series for Enago called the Trinka Podcast, and we talk about language technology and, primarily on the, let's say, AI tech side of things, but also languages, language and how to use it and all of that. So one of my, let's say, aspirations is to have more guests from across the world who would want to share
Yeah,
their viewpoints on some of these topics. And if there is somebody out there who would like to speak to us, please let us know by comments or whatever. I would like
absolutely.
to, and then we can set up a conversation and see if we can convert that into a conversation that can be presented as a podcast. So that's a diversity officer point that I wanted to make. I have two questions. I know that we are already way beyond what we expected to talk, but that's how the conversations are on such
Yeah.
topics. So two things. One, you mentioned Connecticut, and you also mentioned different parts of the U.S. having different
Mhm.
red states and all of that. And we are all aware that California is the most progressive state within the federation. And so, have you had any I would say experiences knowing, researching maybe, or acquaintances where things are different in the state of California as opposed to other states in terms of
Yeah,
LGBTQ? Yeah.
sure. So I would say Connecticut is on the more progressive side as well. So I would say my experiences or my friends' experiences would sort of mirror what's happening in California, though probably California is a little bit more progressive.
Yeah.
I think what really helps is whether your voices are amplified by people who are in power by
Right.
means of a government position or a position of power within the social architecture of the place. And that's something I think people feel rather distinctly depending on where they live, right? So when we were trying to include safe space access and gender neutral bathrooms and those kinds of things within our
Hmm.
contract as part of the union, we had politicians supporting us on those conversations and saying, hey, it's not just about access to X amount of money and X amount of working hours and process for any addressing any retaliation. It's
Right.
also about ensuring safe, welcoming working spaces, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And that made a huge difference because there was political pressure on what is essentially a state funded university to be more inclusive.
Hmm.
Now, definitely that type of allyship
Hmm.
doesn't exist in states that are supposedly supposed to be neutral or unbiased, but definitely have decision makers who are biased on these type of topics.
Right.
It
Right.
can
Right.
work to both your advantage and disadvantage.
Yeah.
But I think the disadvantage is so much more stressful and so much more problematic because really having gender neutral bathrooms is not negatively impacting you in any way if you don't want to use them. But it is definitely impacting people who actually want access,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I always felt that, that give and take between what is happening within the academic bubble and how your voices are supported by those outside of academia and those who actually have decision making power when it comes to policies
Hmm.
is so important.
Hmm.
Even little things like typically the comptroller of the university is the state, I forget what they're called, but essentially governor of the state, right?
Hmm.
It's a huge impact in
Hmm.
terms of how the university may make decisions.
Right.
Um, and I feel that is so much more prominent in India, right? We can have the same level of inclusivity in academic circles within India, let's say, but so much of it is uh, suppressed by what may happen because of
Hmm.
political pressure.
Right.
Right? We have to be honest about the type of history that we have when it comes to social progress in India. There have definitely been rather physical repercussions of being part of the progressive community in India.
Right.
So, of course, it's not as bad as some other places in the world, but should you really be comparing
Yeah.
on that note? But yeah, I think it's a little less pronounced in the US in the sense that it may not lead to violence
Mhm.
as openly, but it's definitely still a key component to the conversation.
Right. Perfectly said. I have a immediate sort of rejoinder to what you just said.
Mhm.
I've been thinking about what you said in terms of uh, violence, I guess. So, I used to write very openly without a care about what I thought about how things should be in
Mhm.
India. And at that point in time, it was not directed to the government. It was just an
Mhm.
opinion sort of a piece. But as I mature, I feel that there is more responsibility on people like me to be a little more pointed. And by pointed, I mean not vitriolic or anything sort of
Mhm.
outright negative or uneducated arguments. I'm talking about directly pointing to legislature and judiciary as to what somebody like me having what with academic experience. I mean, technically,
Right.
there need to be different voices from different, let's say, parts of the society. And in my case, I have a sort of a weird. I'm a musician. I am a doctor, and I am also part of the science, technology and science, STM industry and publishing and everything. So I've been thinking maybe I should, write a little more sort of very well constructed whatever thought pieces on what it should be, but I'm also aware of how things, if I were to promote my own content, if I were to do it, then I would receive so much of
Yeah.
outlashes and the things that one normal would not want to read, as in anybody would not want to read. And
Absolutely.
that's another sort of a dichotomy or double-edged swordness of what we're talking about. And consequently it can be deleterious to my own mental health. So it is a
Yeah.
thing, and but yet I cannot run away from it. It's a responsibility
Yeah.
to do it. So there are a couple of other points, but before I ask you those, I'm going to ask you. You mentioned Obama and then Trump and then now Biden, right? And
Yeah.
I've been on LinkedIn. I've been snooping on you, unashamedly, I would say. So I know that you keep in touch with your
Yeah.
friends and colleagues. So to 2018 onward, we are talking up to, so coming up on 6 years of you being away from your colleagues, and I think half of the Trump's term and the second half,
Yeah.
I mean the first half, sorry, most of Biden's term we're talking about. So have things changed, and do you know how things are in the
I
US now?
think when Trump became the president, there was a lot more open, visible discussion, protests,
Mm-hmm.
actions on several issues, right? LGBTQI plus access is one of them, but I mean, access for the community is one of them, but there was also about reproductive rights,
Mm-hmm.
international community, and multiple issues.
Right.
I think what changes drastically within the US context is how much action there is or how much engagement there is depending on who the
Right.
president is. So I think Biden presidency, probably the action oriented aspect of advocacy was a little bit less, is a little bit less.
Right.
And probably it was a little bit less, even more or less, during Obama's presidency.
Interesting.
And I think that is something which is slightly problematic because issues haven't gone away overnight.
Right. I mean,
Those
they
still
won't.
persist.
They will
They
not.
won't.
Yeah.
They will not.
Yeah.
Neither have people suddenly mellowed out just because the president
Yeah.
is changed now. Um, the vitriol that might be there internally is
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we have to be careful about. And I just want to point out a couple of organizations that actually work in the academic space. There's generate resources for not just people of the community but also allies,
Right.
and have a more action-oriented outlook towards LGBTQI plus issues.
Mm-hmm.
So they do actually leadership summit, which is so important because if you are an inclusive leader, you will make better decisions.
Yeah.
I think. and
Right.
create those open spaces and have more action oriented outlook, even when there is no immediate threat to people's rights, to the
Right.
community's rights. Um, and then there is also, GLESSON, which also works with educators in supporting
Mm.
students towards their efforts for a more inclusive
Right.
community. I think one thing that, of course, I didn't experience directly, but people are now experiencing, my friends are experiencing, is how does it play out
Mm-hmm.
in the corporate sector,
Oh,
right?
I see. Mm.
The advocacy is not as visible, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You may have, if you're a large organization, you may have those groups within the organization with a consistent membership, activity, so on and so forth, and even funding. That's a
Mm.
huge aspect of that. But if you're working in a smaller organization or a not a forward thinking corporate culture, again, they find themselves, missing that piece of their life where they were very active advocates and
Mm-hmm.
now are not. And
Right.
it speaks to my experience as well. I think that I was much more heavily involved in whatever causes
Mm.
as an as a student, as part of the academic community, than I am as part of the corporate community.
Right. Right. Right.
And that's something I've been very conscious about, but
Mm.
perhaps didn't find the spaces to get back to it, which is something, I that's
Yeah.
why I brought up the earlier point about corporate culture and
Yeah.
how much is too much and so on.
No, these are relevant conversation points. I mean, I'm so happy that we are talking about it, and we seem to be, we are comfortable in talking about these things. We
Yeah,
can be self-critical if we want to, right? So because we are talking
yeah,
about what we are doing as in our organizations, and so that's something that I think not many people are able to do so easily, like you and me right now, and that in
hmm,
itself is something that that will probably when people listen to us or watch this the videos
yeah,
of this, so they will probably start thinking about two things I have, considering we cannot go on for the rest of the day because we have other stuff to
yes.
do as well. The first thing I want to ask you is if you currently have. Before that, one point that I wanted to make, and again, I'm not an expert in legislation or the US,
Hmm.
how things are in the US, but at the same time, I'm aware that in Biden's and Obama's terms, maybe the second Obama term and the current Biden term, things to the policy, to move through the two houses and everything, things are more difficult overall, and that's
Yeah,
because of majority not being there for many other things. So there is. Uh, the efforts that one makes in terms of getting things done, in terms of actionable, as you mentioned, might need to take a backseat because there's no point, because eventually it will be whatever you do, it's not going to
yeah,
so maybe that has that is one of the reasons why things have not happened. So just I am again pro. I would say what am I? I mean, I'm not. I don't want to out my political leanings, but I'm pro open, pro liberal. If one were to think that point of view, so I
yeah,
want people to make more changes policy in India, in the US, the rest of the world. It doesn't matter. We are
yeah,
our home is the planet Earth, not a particular nation. That
yeah,
those are stories that we tell. So from that point of view, I have to. I mean, we all have to start thinking about what is happening in terms of legislature and judiciary and social simple aspects of the society in different parts of the world, including from our case, we have clients spanning the globe, right? And so
yeah,
some of the
absolutely.
researchers that seek our services might be in different situations, and we have to be
Yeah,
cognizant of the fact and probably be to factor those into our communications and make
yeah,
them feel special and safe when they're with us.
yeah.
So that leads me to something that I am passionate about, that I think you brought up, and that is also part of our notes. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation that I had with Gayatri Phadke from the Enago Academy team about inclusivity in academia, the LGBTQIA plus perspective. And so this is one of several such episodes that we have done in the Trinka Podcast. And the Trinka Podcast deals with conversations about the publishing industry, about academia. We also talk about language technology and developments like AI. We have conversations with other leaders from the industry, including data scientists Apurv Nagwinkar, is our lead data scientist, and we had a long conversation with him. We've had conversation with Trinka the person who the Trinka AI app is named after. The Trinka AI is a writing assistant for you. It's specifically catered to academic writing, and that's why we have this podcast, to the Trinka Podcast. Dr. Anupama Kapadia was another guest on our podcast, and she has donned a lot of hats, and she currently works with Enago Life Sciences and Enago Academy. So where can you find us? You can find the video form of the podcast on YouTube, as well as on our website, Trinka AI, and the audio form of the podcast can be found on all major podcasting platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon. We are also on social media, the Trinka Podcast brand. You just search for Trinka AI and you'll find us there. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter or X as of now, and WeChat and Weibo. So just search for us and drop us a note if you like the content. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to write to us by email, write to us at podcast@trinka.ai, and I promise you that I'll go through each and every email and respond to you. If you like the content, if you like what we talk about, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and share the content with your friends, family, and colleagues, so that such interesting conversation about, for example, the LGBTQIA plus aspects in academia reach the people who need to listen to such conversation, and it'll help things change. And that's the whole idea of why we have such conversations. And again, on the podcasting platforms, please rate us 5 stars so that the algorithms can push us up. And if you have any suggestions on future topics, please write to us on through any means, I guess on social media or by email or on YouTube comment threads. So once again, on behalf of the entire wonderful team that supports me in creating such content, this is Dr. KK signing off for the Trinka Podcast, academic writing done right. I'll see you in the next one.